It started with the rain. It always did. I was driving back from my brother's house, cutting through the long stretch of desolate road that connected our town to the next. It wasn't the best route, not by a long shot, but it was faster, and I was eager to get home. My gas tank was running low, my playlist had looped for the third time, and the only thing keeping me awake was the dull glow of my headlights cutting through the rain. I first saw him standing at the edge of the road near an old gas station, just a silhouette under the flickering light. A tall man, thin, his face half hidden by a hood. He had his arm out, thumb extended, a classic hitchhiker's pose. I don't normally pick up strangers, but something about the sight of him out there, drenched, made me hesitate. The rain was coming down hard, and the gas station looked abandoned. The nearest town was at least 15 miles away. I pulled over. He moved quickly, opening the passenger side door before I had time to second-guess my decision. As he slid inside, I noticed how he smelled. Not like rain or sweat, but something metallic and thick. Blood. I swallowed hard. "Where you headed?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay even. He took a moment before answering. "West." That was it. No town name. No explanation. Just west. I nodded, trying not to let my nerves show. "I can take you as far as Fairview." He said nothing, just nodded once, slowly, as if he were considering something. Then he settled into his seat, dripping water onto my floor mat. The drive continued in silence for a while, just the sound of rain hammering against the windshield and the occasional whoosh of trees rushing past. I kept sneaking glances at him, at his long, bony fingers, at the way his hood barely concealed his gaunt face. There was something wrong with him. I tried to focus on the road, but a nagging feeling crawled up my spine. I couldn't shake the scent of blood. It was only when we passed the first road sign that I realized something was off. Fairview, 10 miles. I had been driving for over 20 minutes. I glanced at the clock. It hadn't changed. The glowing numbers read 12:03 a.m., just like they had when I picked him up. I hit the brakes. The car skidded slightly on the wet pavement, but I managed to keep control. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Something wrong. The hitchhiker's voice was smooth, almost amused. I looked at him. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted at all to the sudden stop. I forced a laugh. Must be losing track of time. He smiled. His teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too yellow, too many. I swallowed, pressing my foot against the gas pedal. The car lurched forward again. The road stretched on. No more signs. No turns. Just the rain, the trees, and the endless black highway. I reached for my phone. No signal. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice closer now. Too close. I snapped my head toward him. He hadn't moved, but somehow, he felt closer. I forced myself to look back at the road. Fairview had to be coming up soon. But it never did. I drove, and drove, and drove. The clock never changed. The road never ended. And the hitchhiker never stopped smiling. Story 2. It had been a long shift at the bar, the kind that left my bones aching and my patience threadbare. The ride home was the only part of my night I looked forward to. 30 minutes of solitude. Just me, the dark highway, and the hum of my engine. Tonight, though, the rain turned the drive into a battle. The wipers struggled against the downpour, and the world outside my windshield blurred into an unrecognizable smear of black and gray. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my focus locked on the lonely stretch of road ahead. Then I saw her, a girl, standing at the side of the highway, her white dress soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. Her long, dark hair was plastered to her face, her arms wrapped around herself as she shivered in the cold. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored her like any sensible person would. But something about her, maybe the sheer wrongness of her being out there alone in the middle of the night, made me ease my foot off the gas. I rolled down the window, just a crack. "You okay?" Her head snapped toward me so quickly that I flinched. Her eyes, huge and dark, locked onto mine. "Can you take me home?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet under the hammering rain. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to say no. But she didn't look dangerous, just lost. "Yeah, sure," I said, unlocking the door. "Hop in." She slid into the passenger seat, bringing the cold with her. I turned the heat up, stealing a glance at her. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her soaked dress dripping onto the seat. Something about her posture seemed off. Too rigid, too controlled. "What were you doing out there?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She didn't answer right away. Waiting. I forced a chuckle. For what? Her head tilted slightly. A ride. Well, that was obvious. I turned my attention back to the road. Where am I taking you? She gave me an address. I frowned. It was a place I knew well, an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It had been empty for years, ever since the family that lived there had died in a fire. You sure about that? I asked carefully. She didn't respond. A chill ran down my spine. I checked the rearview mirror. Her reflection wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned to look at her. She was smiling now. A slow, creeping grin that spread too wide, stretching the skin of her face in a way that wasn't human. I fumbled for the door handle, but before I could move, her hand shot out, ice-cold fingers clamping around my wrist. Drive, she whispered. My breath hitched. I don't know why, but I did. I drove. The road twisted and turned in ways it shouldn't have. The highway was gone, replaced by narrow, winding paths I didn't recognize. The rain had stopped, but the night felt heavier, pressing in around us. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. I was shaking. Where are we? I whispered. She tilted her head again, studying me with those two dark eyes. Almost home. The trees lining the road grew denser, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. My headlights flickered. A house appeared ahead. Not the abandoned one I knew. Something older. Rotten. Its windows gaped like empty eye sockets, its walls sagging as if the earth itself were trying to swallow it whole. I didn't want to stop, but my foot moved on its own, pressing the brake. The girl turned to me. Thank you for the ride. She opened the door and stepped out. I don't know what possessed me to look back as she walked toward the house. Maybe I needed to make sure she was real. But as she reached the porch, her body shifted, her limbs lengthening, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. She turned back toward me one last time. Her mouth stretched open, and then she crawled inside. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning wildly as I tore away from that place. The road blurred past in a haze of panic and headlights, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. I didn't stop until I saw something familiar, the gas station near my apartment. I pulled into the lot, gasping for breath. My hands were still shaking when I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But as I glanced at the passenger seat, my stomach dropped. A single, wet handprint was smeared across the fabric. I never drove that highway again, and I never pick up hitchhikers. Not anymore. Story 3. The road stretched on forever, or at least that's how it felt. The trees on either side of the highway were a black void, broken only by the occasional passing road sign that blurred in the glow of my headlights. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the trip lulling me into a half-daze. I needed to stop soon. The gas station that appeared in the distance looked like a beacon in the dark. The old neon sign flickered, struggling to stay alive, and the station itself looked abandoned, save for the single car parked beside the only pump. I pulled in, relieved to finally take a break. The air was cold when I stepped out of the car. The kind of cold that cut through layers and settled in your bones. I rubbed my hands together, glancing at the other car. It was empty. No driver in sight. I hurried inside. The convenience store was as lifeless as the station outside. The clerk, a tired-looking man with hollow eyes, barely acknowledged me. I grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips before heading to the counter. Long drive? The clerk asked, his voice raspy. Yeah, heading north. He nodded slowly, as if considering something. Then, in a tone that was almost too casual, he asked, You see anyone outside? I frowned. No. Why? He didn't answer. Just shook his head and rang up my items. As I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the man standing by my car. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. His face was turned away, his posture unnervingly still. I stopped mid-step. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. The man slowly turned his head toward me. His face was pale, gaunt, with deep shadows beneath his eyes. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Going north? He asked. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he were speaking just loud enough for me to hear over the wind. Something in my gut twisted. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the store, lock the doors, and wait until he was gone. But then I saw his hands, shaking, unsteady. His knuckles were raw, like he had been gripping something too tightly for too long. His clothes were damp from the misty air, and for a split second, I wondered if he had been walking for miles, stranded in the middle of nowhere. I had promised myself I'd never pick up hitchhikers. But something about him, maybe the way he looked at me, like he was pleading without saying the words, made me hesitate. Against my better judgment, I nodded. Yeah, I can give you a lift. His smile widened just a fraction, and he moved toward the passenger door. I climbed into the driver's seat, every nerve in my body on high alert. The moment he settled in, I regretted it. The silence between us was suffocating. He sat too still, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his head tilted slightly, listening. After a few minutes, I cleared my throat. Where are you heading? He turned his head toward me, slow and deliberate. Just a little further up. His voice was softer than before, almost too soft to hear. I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. We drove in silence. The rain started again, a slow drizzle that tapped against the windshield like fingers. The road stretched on, empty and endless. Then I noticed something. The gas gauge. I had filled up at the station, yet the needle was dropping faster than it should have been. I frowned, my eyes darting to the man beside me. He hadn't moved. I shook it off. Maybe I was just tired. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The road felt wrong. I knew this highway. I had driven it before. But the exits I expected to see weren't there. The mile markers were off. My skin prickled. I glanced at my phone. No signal. My passenger suddenly leaned forward slightly, staring at the road. Mind if I ask you something? He whispered. My mouth was dry. Sure. His fingers twitched against his knee. Have you ever heard someone calling your name? He murmured. When you were alone? A chill ran down my spine. I forced a chuckle. What? He turned his head toward me, the darkness swallowing the lower half of his face. You ever hear it? He whispered again. Late at night, just before sleep. Someone saying your name. My grip tightened on the wheel. No. A pause. He said, voice almost thoughtful. And then he smiled. I stared straight ahead, my pulse pounding. I wanted him out of my car. Now. The rain picked up, heavier now. The wipers fought against it, smearing the glass. My headlights flickered. Something was wrong. The road, was it curving? It hadn't before. And then, up ahead, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the highway. I hit the brakes, the car skidding on the wet pavement. My hands clenched the wheel, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. A man. Tall. Thin. Dressed in dark clothes. My mouth went dry. I snapped my head to my passenger. He was staring at me, still smiling. The man in the road took a step forward. I threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing against the pavement. The hitchhiker let out a soft chuckle. And then, he whispered my name. My vision blurred. A ringing filled my ears. My stomach lurched, my mind fogged, my limbs felt sluggish. No. I pressed the gas pedal, the car lurching backward. The figure in the road vanished. And then, so did my passenger. The weight in the seat beside me was gone. The whisper still lingered in the air, curling around me like smoke. I drove. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I reached the next gas station, I stumbled out of the car, shaking. The attendant inside looked up as I entered, his face pale. You look like you've seen a ghost, he muttered. I almost laughed. Instead, I turned back to the road. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing, but the whisper still clung to my skin. Even now, some nights, when the wind is just right, I hear my name, and it's his voice. Story 4. I should have gone straight home. That thought gnawed at me as I drove down the pitch-black stretch of highway, my fingers gripping the wheel tight. It was late, past midnight, and the rain hadn't let up since I left the diner. I had just finished my closing shift, exhausted and half-functioning on autopilot. I wasn't even supposed to take this route, but I had been running low on gas, and the next station was just a few miles up this back road. It was one of those desolate stretches, no streetlights, no signs of life. Just endless trees pressing in on both sides. Then I saw him, a man standing by the road, half hidden in the darkness. My heart stuttered. He was tall, lean, his clothes dark and soaked through from the rain. His hood was pulled up, casting his face in shadow. His arm was outstretched, thumb pointing up. I don't pick up hitchhikers. I never have. But something about him, the way he stood there, motionless, as if he'd been waiting just for me, made my stomach twist. I should have kept driving. Instead, I slowed down. I rolled the window down just an inch. You okay? He didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I need a ride. I hesitated. I knew better than this. But before I could answer, something shifted. I blinked, and suddenly he wasn't standing beside the car anymore. He was inside it. I heard the soft creak of leather as he settled into the back seat, his breath slow and steady. My blood ran cold. I hadn't unlocked the doors. I hadn't seen him move, but he was there, sitting behind me. I forced myself to breathe, my fingers digging into the steering wheel. My skin prickled with cold sweat. "Where are you heading?" I asked, my voice coming out too thin. Silence. Then, just as softly as before, he whispered, "Home." I swallowed hard. "Where's home?" The rain drummed against the car, a suffocating sound. "Not far." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. My hands were shaking. I put the car in drive, my mind racing. I needed to get to the gas station. That was my plan. Get to the station, get out of the car, and run. The road stretched on endlessly, the trees blurring together. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see his face. Just the shape of him, sitting impossibly still. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. Then he whispered, "You picked the wrong road." A shiver crawled up my spine. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse roaring in my ears. "What? You shouldn't have stopped." My breath hitched. I wanted to look back, to confirm he was really there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Then he whispered my name. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told him my name. The car lurched as I accidentally swerved onto the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath the tires before I jerked the wheel, steadying it back onto the road. My heartbeat thundered in my chest. I swallowed hard. "How do you know my name?" Silence. The air inside the car felt heavier now, pressing down on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see his face. I flicked my eyes up to the mirror. He was gone. The seat was empty. My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled against the wheel. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. He was just there. I heard him. I turned, slowly, to look at the back seat. Nothing. The leather was untouched, completely dry, as if no one had been sitting there at all. A cold, suffocating silence filled the car. Then, a whisper, right by my ear. "Don't turn around." Every muscle in my body locked up. The air turned ice cold. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Something was in the car with me. I felt it behind me, a presence so overwhelming it sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. I could hear breathing, slow, measured, right against the back of my neck. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. And then, a shadow shifted in the mirror. Something was crawling out of the back seat. I didn't wait to see what it was. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching against the wet pavement as I sped down the road. The whispering started again, a low, murmuring sound, too many voices all at once. The temperature plummeted, my breath fogging up the windshield. I refused to look in the mirror. I didn't stop, not for miles. When I finally reached the gas station, I tore into the parking lot, jumped out of the car, and ran inside. The clerk stared at me like I was crazy. "You okay?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there, shaking, staring back at my car. The back door was still shut, but there was something in the window. A handprint. Not from the inside. From the outside. Like something had just crawled out. I didn't go back to the car that night. I called a friend, had them pick me up, and left the car sitting there until morning. When I finally worked up the nerve to check inside, the back seat was dry. There were no footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. But the handprint? It was still there. I scrubbed it off. Sold the car 2 weeks later. And I never pick up hitchhikers. Not anymore. Story 5. I was 200 miles from home, cruising down a desolate highway when my gas light blinked on. It was just past midnight, and the road ahead stretched into endless darkness, the occasional road sign reflecting in my headlights. I had taken a shortcut. One Google swore would shave 30 minutes off my trip, but it had led me through nowhere towns and onto an empty stretch of highway that felt abandoned. The only thing breaking the stillness was the rain, relentless and steady, drumming against the windshield. Then, up ahead, I spotted something that made my stomach twist. A figure stood at the side of the road. A man. He wasn't waving, wasn't moving, just standing there, illuminated in the wash of my headlights. His back was to me, his head slightly tilted, like he was listening for something. I should have kept driving. I don't pick up strangers. That's a rule I've always lived by. But as I passed him, I saw his face. And he saw mine. His eyes locked onto mine through the rain-streaked glass. Hollow. Dark. Empty. And then he smiled. I don't know why, but my foot pressed on the brakes. Maybe it was guilt, or curiosity, or something else. I don't know, but I stopped. Big mistake. The rain pounded against the roof of the car as I sat there, heart hammering, fingers gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The man was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head, scanning the darkness outside. The highway was empty. I reached for the lock on my door. Then, knock, knock. I jumped. The sound came from the back of the car. 2 soft knocks. I swallowed hard, pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't turn around. I stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel, willing myself to stay calm. Then it came again. Knock, knock. I couldn't breathe. Slowly, my eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, movement. A shadow shifted in the back seat. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as the car lurched forward. My heart was in my throat, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't check the mirror again. I didn't want to know if he was still there. The road blurred past in a haze of rain and headlights. I drove for miles, refusing to stop, refusing to slow down. Eventually, I spotted a gas station in the distance. A small, flickering sign, barely visible through the rain. I pulled in fast, parking directly under the lights. I turned off the engine, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Then, with every ounce of courage I had left, I looked in the back seat. Nothing. It was empty. The seats were dry. There were no footprints. No signs that anyone had ever been there. I exhaled shakily, forcing a laugh. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the exhaustion was getting to me. I climbed out of the car, still glancing over my shoulder as I walked to the gas pump. The night air was thick, heavy with rain and something else, something I couldn't name. I started pumping the gas, trying to shake the lingering fear, when something caught my eye. A figure stood at the edge of the lot, just beyond the glow of the gas station lights. Tall, motionless, facing me. I froze. My stomach knotted. I couldn't see his face, but I knew. It was him. And then, slowly, too slowly, he raised his hand. Knock, knock. Except this time, he wasn't knocking on my car. He was knocking on the air. My knees went weak. I dropped the gas nozzle. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. He stood 20 feet away. There was nothing between us. And yet, knock, knock. The sound echoed, hollow and wrong, like it came from inside my own head. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. The gas station clerk was inside, staring at me through the window. I turned toward the building, and when I looked back, the man was gone. I didn't finish pumping the gas. I didn't pay. I got in the car and peeled out of that lot so fast my tires left skid marks. I drove. I didn't stop again until I was home, locking every door, every window. For days, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. Knock, knock. Soft, gentle, insistent. I don't know what he wanted. I don't want to know. I've taken that same highway before, during the day, when the sun is high and the world feels safe. And every time, I pass the spot where I saw him. But there's nothing there. Nothing except a single sign, half buried in the overgrown grass. No stopping. No pickups. And beneath that, in faded black letters, in memory of those who did.